Welcome everyone to Anti-Racist Visions of a required course on race and justice. And welcome to this afternoon's session of Freedom School. I am delighted to be able to introduce this session because of the incredible panelists who are here, who are to speak. And that doesn't include me, but that includes our my incredible colleagues. And the first person I would like to introduce is Professor Hiba Abajaderi, who is an associate professor in the history department, and who has, with Dr. Sherry Bowen, who is an associate professor in communication and is currently serving as the faculty coordinator of the Intergroup Dialogue program. Hiba and Sherry have been serving on the URJC committee for the Equitas task force, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. And I'm delighted to also introduce Dr. Rachel Skerlock-Lowe, an assistant professor in the Education and Counseling Department, who has been so instrumental in what we've been doing in our work. And I can see that my colleagues are moving me on quickly. And what we want to do is say welcome to you. Usually, if we had more time, we'd go around. We want to know who you are and why you're here. But in order to give us at least a little bit of time at the end, we're going to skip that and move first into our land acknowledgement. And as you see here, one of the things that we believe is an important new practice at Villanova is to acknowledge and pay respect to the original peoples of this land, and that those would be the Lenape people. And one of the things that I would have you understand is that there is a great deal to be known about the Lenape. And one of the reasons why we do this land acknowledgement is because we believe at Villanova that part of our mission is to recognize ongoing legacies of oppression so that we can not only address them, but also figure out the best ways of remediating those situations. So as we continue moving past the land acknowledgement, what I'd like to do very quickly is, as anybody who knows me knows, I love to work with a good thesis statement. So this is what we're going to be doing today, and hold us accountable for it. We want to tell you the story of the URJC, the University Race and Justice course, that is based on a recommendation of the Equitas task force. And if there are any terms in there you don't understand, don't worry, because we're going to talk about them. But look at this last part, and this is really important. All of us in this session today, we hope that we will envision the future of the course and the power of this anti-racist work at Villanova. I would be remiss if I didn't also introduce Dr. Eloise Berry of the Office of Intercultural Affairs, who is also co-moderating this session and in her office and in her work in student life, working on these very issues. So moving on, what we want to do is begin to identify some of the key terms that I've already introduced, such as the Presidential Task Force on Race. As we know, we all lived through the summer of racial discontent, and that what in the murder of George Floyd on television had a resounding impact on America, and it also had an impact on Villanova. Father Peter created the task force, and with it, as we go to the next slide, gave us some very specific tasks. And there were actually three sources for of input on the tasks for the Equitas group. If you move to the first one, Father Peter gave us a very specific charge. And in his charge, he talked about all of the things that he had been hearing from not only students of color, but all students, not only from faculty and staff of color, but from all faculty, that we need to be a more diverse institution, that we need to be a more welcoming institution. And in particular, one of the things that was on both his list as well as the list of the Black students was that we needed to have better trained faculty who could talk about important issues like race in the classroom. The other thing is that there needed to be throughout the university a required course on diversity, on diversity. And interestingly, I will say that this is not a new demand, but we've actually heard this for a number of years. The third source, as Father was putting together the task force, is the strategic plan, Rooted and Restless. I'm sure we've all heard and know that diversity, equity, and inclusion was a very large part of that. And as we looked at that, we knew that it wasn't that we were going to redo the pieces of the strategic plan, but rather strengthen and extend some of those very issues. And those included creating greater inclusion in the university, and as well as enhancing the diversity in faculty and faculty, staff, and students. If we go to the next slide, one of the things that you'll see is that just like we began this presentation with a thesis statement, as the Equitas task force got together and began to think seriously about their task, we realized quickly that diversity was too small a term for what we needed to do. And when I say too small a term, no, we haven't left anti-racism yet. But when we say diversity merely means difference. And one of the things that we had a very clear understanding of is simply adding to the melanin content of the university was not going to fundamentally change it. That there were too many things that the people who were here said needed to be changed for simply diversity to handle it. And even when we added inclusion, that was important, but it wasn't enough, because what we need to be talking about is equity and justice. And you can't have equity without anti-racism. Now, we're going to talk about anti-racism in a moment, but before I get to that, I just wanted to say that a part of the Equitas group's work was to formulate this anti-racism statement. And I hope that as I've been chatting through here, that you have had a chance to take a look at these powerful words, because what you'll see, what this statement has done, is it has linked this search for justice for all people and the very mission of Villanova University. And it is the fusing of the equity and justice work with the mission that has really given us the purpose and direction for the task force. I'm going to leave it at that and then move on to what you'll see here are the Equitas goals. I'm sure you can read them all, but what you'll see is that where we start with academic anti-racist evaluation, that is that we have a group who has worked and has now delivered to the deans a way in which the very departments and academic programs in the college can systematically look at what they teach, how they teach, and the materials that they use to teach in a way that will give them an understanding of how they are dealing with these issues of race in the classroom. Clearly, we're here to talk about the second piece, the race and justice course. Interestingly, we took the students' demand for a diversity course, and in order to make it applicable for the 21st century, we needed to make it an anti-racist course. And then as you look down, diverse community, both faculty, staff, students. We talked about campus climate, race, and they had a program this morning, race and policing, student relations, communications, and even professional development, where we talked about, all of this is important, but if we don't have staff and faculty who stay here much longer than 4 years, understanding what we mean by this, then it's not going to really amount to significant change. Very quickly, I'd like to talk about 3 very important highlights that have been accomplished. One, as I mentioned before, this academic anti-racist evaluation has already been disseminated to the deans, and I know that they're working on refining it and then sending it out to their diversity committees. This University Race and Justice course, which some of you may know is actually being taught right now. It's actually in its second pilot. The amazing Dr. Hiba is done a wonderful job of creating a syllabus and had a fabulous first course. Dr. Bowen directed the dialogue in that course. It was very powerful, and we're moving on to the second iteration. And some of you may have already participated in Equitas Community Foundations. This is a new staff development program that's partially sort of asynchronous, where you can complete some modules online and then come together for a discussion. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that anti-racism work is alive and well at Villanova. What we're here today to talk about specifically is what's going to go on inside the classroom. So let's continue our program.
All right. Thank you very much, Terry. It's so much fun to be involved with this with all of you and to be here presenting on this today. One of the things we want to do is just take a minute. It's so important that we have a shared language. So in the chat, share a few words that come to mind when you see or hear the word anti-racism. And for us, it's so important to bring in everyone's voice, and Zoom really makes that a little more challenging, but the chat lets us do that a little bit, as long as you don't get distracted by mid-chat, right, or mid-discussion. So we have protesting, educating people, sticking up for others, right, this pushing, thanks, Christopher, justice and deconstruction and learning, intersectional oppression, acceptance. So it's about pushing, it's about pulling, and it's about bringing people in together. So I'm going to move on. Thank you for sharing. To just start to define anti-racism and really share with you where we're sitting. And anti-racism includes beliefs, actions, movements, and policies adopted or developed to oppose racism. So to understand racism, I share Beverly Tatum's metaphor of smog. You can see it from far away, but when you are in it, you don't realize how pervasive it is, how it's all around you. It's in the air we breathe. And some people, when they breathe it, they get sick. They have a reaction to smog, right? And just like that, racism affects some of us more than others. But the point is that it's embedded, the racism is embedded in our socio-political historical structures. So that while we can feel and see racism sometimes, and some people are affected by it daily, I would argue we all are, we're not aware of how it affects us and to the depth that it does. So in a sense, it's invisible to those of us living within it. And one of the things I usually share with people is that I'm a proud Canadian. I've lived here for a long time now, but I hold on to my maple leaf with both fists. And as a Canadian, having moved here, I can really see aspects of racism in American society, because those are the moments where these structural differences are different to me. And I go, oh, hold on a minute, right? But I also recognize that I'm oblivious to some of Canada's problems as well. So having moved here helps me see the smog in Canada, and moving here, I also can name the smog and shout it out a little bit. So racism, if we think about Ibram Kendi's definition of it, it's the belief that racial inequalities are rooted in the person. In Stamped, he talks about this, Stamped from the Beginning, he talks about this beautifully. And when he writes the YA version with Jason Reynolds in 2020, which is released on March 13th, which is the day, at least in our district, we went into lockdown in Radnor, releasing this book at the beginning of what Terry called the summer of our racial discontent has really amplified how we talk about race and racism and anti-racism. So Kendi and Reynolds lay out a map of you're either racist or you're anti-racist. Racism justifies the oppression of racialized groups at interpersonal, institutional, and cultural levels. And anti-racism is this pushing back against it. It is the belief that racial inequities are rooted in the system and that we must work to challenge and change the system. So I'm going to draw on another metaphor of Beverly Tatum's, which is the moving sidewalk, and the idea that we live in a racist society that is moving us all along. And while some of us are willing to benefit from racism in really overt ways, which is walking faster along the sidewalk, Others just stand still, thinking they're not participating in racism, but we're all moving forward in a racist system. And anti-racism is getting off that moving sidewalk and moving in the other direction, or I would say even like sticking little rocks in the gears, right, to stop that sidewalk from moving forward. So to be anti-racist is to do this active opposing to racism. And we have to think about and challenge how it's built into our social fabric in countless ways, and we have to actively resist it. And anti-racist educators then should educate to challenge the system and to change the system and not the children. It's not a one and done, and it's not either. It's a process that requires learning and relearning. So when we think about it from an education perspective, anti-racist pedagogy is grounded in belief that educators need to implement anti-racist strategies into their instruction, assessment, and curriculums. As we teach, we work to build our history and our collective knowledge, and this has the potential to change our understanding of how we interact with curriculum at individual and systemic levels. So for just briefly, I want to say that at the individual level, an anti-racist goal is to gain a new understanding of ourselves, but also of others, right? We're trying to expand, as someone said, our understanding of identities. It's also systemic in that we gain a new understanding of how society is organized, the rules that govern it, and the norms that help maintain the organization. So to be an anti-racist educator is to strive to achieve 4 goals. It is to ground our teaching in cultural competence, incorporating the knowledge, skills, and practices that help students recognize and appreciate their culture of origin, and also learning to develop fluency in at least one other culture. So we're really working to be aware of identity and culture and how we learn and engage in society. It's recognizing the needs, it acknowledges and recognizes the contribution, experiences, and needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And it recognizes that all education is political. That is, the purpose and structure of learning is not innate, but guided by larger social and cultural ideologies. And this is a really important part of anti-racism, right? Is this challenging of oppressive structures, addressing historical racism and connecting it to present day realities with the purpose of disrupting systems of privilege and oppression. There's this expectations of excellence for all students, including subject area knowledge, right? We want our students to be able to leave the classroom with the genius that they arrived in, knowing they have it and that they've developed it through skill development and intellectual development. All students have the ability to succeed, and believing this shifts the responsibility for failure from an individual student to a system. How is a system failing to prepare our students for the world in which we live, in which we would like to live in? Finally, there's this ability to take action, that we want our students to leave with the sense of agency. So a core tenet of anti-racist teaching is recognizing that culture matters for everyone. And this means recognizing our students' cultural identities, but and also interrogating our own. So as we think about what anti-racist pedagogy is asking this question, how does my class perpetuate racism? And so we do this work in a number of ways. And when we move on to the next slide, thank you. I'm going to think about how do we do this for the URJC, the University Race and Justice course. So I got involved last summer as through the Race and Justice Dialogue Institute. And if you are interested in learning more about it, it's a 4-day course in May that is excellent and really gives you a chance to really practice and engage in these and develop your knowledge. And during these conversations, there was this realization that the URJC couldn't just change course content and call itself anti-racist. And of course, the dialogue experience and the modules were built in. So there was this understanding of that. But there was this conversation of like, what does anti-racism do? How does it disrupt our expectations in the classroom and of curriculum? And it requires this interrogation of all aspects of teaching and education. So we could easily understand how changing curriculum was essential, that is content area knowledge, but we struggle a little bit more to think about how that changes our instructional styles and our assessments. And the composition lit scholar Asawi Inui says it's not enough to bring in anti-racist content, but we must shift our pedagogies, including instructional style and assessment methods. Otherwise, we reinforce habits and patterns of racism. So recall, anti-racist teaching is a social justice effort at its core, and it asks us to not only share diverse stories, voices, and expertise, but to raise consciousness of systems of power that allow some to be oppressed and others to be privileged. So we need to do more than just share diverse content. We have to break traditional patterns of teaching and assessment. So we interrogated each layer of the course for patterns, and we thought about that. And so that was our goal, is like, what does it truly mean to create an anti-racist course that achieves the goal of anti-racist pedagogy? So in terms of the content, that was straightforward. We knew that the stories, perspectives, and expertise of Black, Indigenous, people of color were absent in the curriculum. That was already in process. The instruction is thinking about how is the instruction anti-racist? Well, it's designed to just disrupt norms of typical undergraduate classrooms. And there's a couple of ways it does it. First, it creates these modules of expert content. This builds and really prioritizes the intellectual development of the students while bringing in multiple voices, perspectives, and experiences. There's also the dialogue experience, right? This decenters the teacher as the arbiter of all knowledge, and really builds the sense of community of learners. And finally, there's a multiple and varied sections across the university and the colleges. And this is really important. There isn't going to be one way to teach this course, right? There isn't a single story. This is the whole point of this, is to disrupt the idea that there's a single story of Villanova. So these multiple and varied sections allow us to focus on the process side of the course. What does it mean to do anti-racist work versus how do you become an anti-racist person, right? We want to learn how to be anti-racist in practice. But where we struggled a bit was the assessment piece. Assessment is how students are evaluated and valued, and it really was bound up in our own personal practices and beliefs, but also in institutional ones. So we had to really unpack what are the power asymmetries in assessment. And we determined, and there are more, I'm sure, but we determined that one of the biggest issues is who determines the grade, right? The professor determines that grade, and that automatically sets up a power asymmetry. We also think about what counts as worthy of being graded. We know that traditionally it's products. Write a paper on this, and it will be, a demonstration of your knowledge in this neat little bundle. We wanted to focus on the process. And then we had to think about how we value student work and how we communicate students' value to them. So are they just simply valued by an essay they write, or are they valued for what they bring into the classroom? And in my classes, we watch a talk by Celeste Headley on how to have a good conversation, and she gives you 10 points. And one of them is, everyone is an expert of something, right? And she says this, and my students always resonate with that as a way to give themselves authority to speak up and be in the class, but also a reason to listen to their peers. All right, so these were some of the challenges for assessment. And as we worked through this, we identified 3 areas of challenges, and one of them was deconditioning ourselves. I'm not going to speak for everyone, but I have decades of education behind me. I have been a student and I have been a teacher, and I think that I've been pretty successful at it. So how do I unpack my definition of what counts as success and change my own teaching habits? So we have to undo our internalized beliefs of the student-teacher relationship and what counts as learning. We also have to think about institutional expectations. And this includes like formal policies that the institution has, department practices, disciplinary practices. What do we do to push and resist the way that racism is woven into these practices? And one of the biggest ways we did it is we rewrote the outcomes for the course so that they really focused on the process and were anti-racist in practice. And finally, a third challenge was, and Ahibba will speak to this more, is student expectations for what counts as learning, right? We have a lot of students who've been very, very successful, like I described myself, and learning looks like something for them. So how do we support students as they come into this anti-racist space? And how do we respond to their responses to it? So that's something Hibba will speak about. But as we revised the course outcomes, we engaged in reflections and we worked together to disrupt institutional expectations. And we created a document called the URJC Learning Outcomes and Assessment using an anti-racist lens. That's a mouthful. And we created 12 new outcomes that were divided evenly across curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. and they were aligned with these 4 expectations of anti-racist education. 1, awareness of identity and culture, our own and others. 2, raising critical consciousness. How are you demonstrating that you've engaged in this course? What are you doing? What does it look like in practice? 3, are we creating expectations of excellence for all students related to subject knowledge? So this is content mastery. What are you taking from the course? What have you learned? How have you intellectually expanded your mind? And number 4, expectations that students will leave with a sense of agency. That is, again, this idea of decentering the teacher so that the students feel like they have some authority as they leave the space. So next slide, please. So why does it matter? I'm just going to wrap up, and I've probably taken too long, but why does it matter to do this at Villanova? First of all, decentering whiteness and interrupting racism requires ongoing vigilance. And Barbara Applebaum writes that whiteness continuously ensnares and ambushes white people so that whiteness finds ways to hide. Anti-racism isn't a one and done. It isn't a thing we become. It is a process of becoming. We are always engaging in anti-racist work. And it's so important at a predominantly white institution to be aware of this. And even though everyone at Villanova isn't white, I know that. I'm going to draw from Jose Medina, who says oppressed subjects can internalize or fall victim to socially generated illusions, but they have more resources for a richer and experiential life to dismantle this socialization. So this vigilance needs to be done to disrupt whiteness so that we can all participate more equally, and also to value and amplify the resources and the strengths of what Medina says are the oppressed subjects. We also need to build in responsiveness. Like when we look at the mission statement and the enduring commitments in Villanova's documentation, it is about preparing our students to leave this world, this campus, and make the world a better place. We need to engage in this process now so that when they leave our classrooms, they are more prepared for comments. They don't feel defensive or they're not apologizing. And that could be defensive for saying something racist, but it can also be forced to apologize because you've made somebody feel bad because you've called out their racism. So this is a great practice for becoming anti-racist people. And finally, to counter ignorance, right? We actively, I'm going to call on Jose Medina again and say active racial ignorance involves being cognitively and effectively numb to the lives of racial others. This course counters that ignorance. And thinking about a comment that we shared just before this started, that St. Augustine was not white, right? But we never think of, well, maybe not all of us, but his not whiteness is never part of the conversation or is rarely part of the conversation. So to close, I just want to draw on Barbara Applebaum's words again and saying that being an anti-racist white, which is where I'm coming from, and I realize I don't speak for everybody today, being an anti-racist white is a project that requires another step and does not end in a white person's having arrived in the form of an idyllic anti-racist. And I'm really grateful to be doing this work with this amazing team. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So my job is to flesh out a little bit more in detail what the URJC, as we have envisioned it up to this point, what it looks like, building on the sort of theoretical framework that Rachel has sort of outlined for us. I do want to say a couple of things. That number one, the URJC alone is not the panacea of racism on our campus. And, we do need to manage the expectations of what this course is meant to do. It is meant to equip students with a number of things that I'll go through in a moment. But and we see it as working in concert with the other recommendations of Equitas so that we see sort of a sea change in terms of change, anti-racism change and reform at Villanova. But it in no way is going to overnight resolve the problem of racism, either on campus, obviously, or beyond. Okay. This is a vision that we have that we've put together. So it is a work in progress. So things are flexible, but this is the way that we've envisioned it and we have implemented it up until now. We would love your input should you want to make recommendations or see blind spots that we don't see. So the way that we have envisioned the course is that it has three interlocking and what am I thinking about? Just had a little moment there. So three interlocking pieces that work hand in hand. There will be in all iterations, which means every college, if you can go back real quick. So all iterations of this course, whether it's in CLAS, engineering, nursing, or VSB, will have their own iterations of this course, but all iterations will have these three moving parts that work together. The asynchronous modules is what we're calling it, and what these are the content that Rachel was talking about earlier. This is going to be a high quality documentary-like production that Professor Hezekiah Lewis in communication is producing, and it draws on the expertise on our campus by our experts talking about various aspects of race. It starts with the Villanova origin story. So there are sort of 10 parts to the asynchronous production, where 3 of them are on the Villanova origin story, where we talk about Augustine. We talk about the Molden story, who are the benefactors of Villanova. They also happen to be, both of them, right? Augustine and the Moldens happen to be of African descent. And of course, the Moldens being a slave family. So what happened to Villanova, right? The irony of a PWI like Villanova is that we have this heritage of Black excellence, as if you know the Molden story, or thinking about Augustine. So how did it get to where we are today? So this question of historical erasures, this question of whitewashing absolutely is a critical piece of that. Then we go into the intellectual thinking about race. What is race as a social construction? What is race as intersectional? What is race as global? So these are the fundamental building blocks of race in terms of informational content that all students should know. And the last 4 parts are it's not just about race and racism being attitudinal. Race as an attitude is very much a product of race as institutionalized. So here we're looking at the empirical outcomes of racist thinking. How does race get institutionalized? So here we took a couple of examples by looking at, for example, segregation, both in housing and education. We're looking at, what is it called? Mass incarceration and policing, environmental justice, or environmental racism, and the media. So we're giving students an opportunity to see how there are implications that are very much systematic, that are about systems that are structural, that are the outcome of the racist thinking that they would have gotten in the second bit of modules before that. So that is universal content to all iterations of the course, regardless of college. Okay, how instructors use them can be different, but those synchronous modules will be that. Then there's the dialogue experience, which is based on the IGR program. I will defer to our IGR faculty director, Dr. Bowen, to talk about that in a moment. And then there's the disciplinary content. The disciplinary content is where we have college-specific iterations, where a faculty of record who is overseeing that particular iteration will develop the disciplinary content within their college, where they are looking at legacies of race, racism, how disciplines within that college explore it, what questions students can ask regarding those legacies, regarding how racism comes to be institutionalized. And it's all premised on the notion, particularly in my iteration, on the idea that Dr. Skurlock-Lowe brought up earlier, which is knowledge is very much political. You do not go into a class and the professor's objective and they're giving you objective knowledge. It's very much immersed in power itself. And so how do students become more critical in how they think about that knowledge, and that knowledge particularly of race? All right, Sherry, you can go to the next one. And in fact, I think so let me just do some highlights real quick. And if you want to hear more specific or elaborate responses to this, feel free to ask them in the Q&A. But I wanted to just highlight how we came up with, at least in my iteration, the learning outcomes and the requirements, how we are assessing, and what does the disciplinary content look like. If I can be host, I can share the syllabus real quick. If I can be made a co-host.
You should be able to as a co-host. You are co-host.
Okay. Oh, it's telling me I'm not.
Okay, hang on. Oh,
So
that's because I have to stop.
right. That's fine. So in the meantime, I'll just bring up, not yet. I'll just bring up how we went about, especially starting from the learning outcomes. This was something that was a bit of an epiphany for me. Before you come up with the syllabus, you need to start with your anti-racist learning outcomes, because that then dictates everything else. It dictates your content, it dictates your pedagogical approaches, it dictates your requirements, it dictates your assessments. So you have to start with the outcomes. Your outcomes, if they're anti-racist, then they will inform all the rest of the moving pieces of creating a course syllabus. Am I ready?
You should be.
Okay, here it is. So I can move down. So this is the iteration for this semester. It is running as a history course within the department because we have not yet figured out how we're going to, obviously as a university-wide course, where is it going to be housed is still a question up in the air. But for the pilot, it is in the history department. You look at the, if I can go over here, the anti-racist outcomes. So this is what I meant. This is what anchors the entire course. If you look at them, they all anchor the 4 outcomes that we came up with that Dr. Skorlaklo just mentioned. And what's critical about these learning outcomes is that we basically base them on this idea of learning how to act. And I'm just making that up as a way to sort of encapsulate what we did. Learning how to act, and that has a kind of double entendre, a double meaning. On the one hand, it means learning about racial and other intersectional systems of oppression, right? It's the content that you're learning in order for you to learn how to act, right? To know how to act. You cannot act in anti-racism without knowledge. So on the one hand, you need to learn how to act by learning content. On the other hand, learning how to act is also about learning how to act in terms of anti-racism. What is that agency? What does that look like? How can you be an ally? And part of that is developed in the dialogic part that I think Dr. Bowen will talk about in a moment. So this question of learning to act in this double meaning is really grounded in this notion of co-constructing a learning environment where both the student and the faculty are learning from one another, and that they are teaching one another. And that's the question of co-constructing, that students have experiential knowledge that is absolutely critical to bring into the space in order for them to understand what anti-racism is, in terms of understanding the experiences of others, becoming more self-critical about their own social identities, and then thinking about, okay, now that I understand that, I understand how I operate within this larger system of oppression. Now I know how to better act and to more effectively act in anti-racist ways, right? So self-reflection is super critical. And then of course, action. If you look at the requirements, they reflect those 4 outcomes. So thinking about dialogue, again, Dr. Bowen will talk more about that as an anti-racist pedagogy. But that is a space that is where students are grappling with their emotional responses to some of the intellectual content they're learning from both the asynchronous modules as well as the disciplinary content. They're grappling with it. This is a space where they're becoming self-critical. This is a space where they're learning about others. This is a space where they're learning dialogic communication skills to better learn about others, right? How do you find out about somebody else's experience without just saying, who are you, right? There are ways to do that. And then there are other ways we came up with in terms of requirements for them to do the same thing. Self-reflection, through journaling week to week, right? So this is a place where they're also grappling with some of that material, but they're also becoming very self-critical and learning how to query, to ask these really critical questions, not just of others, but themselves. Why is it that I believe this? Why don't I think about my own racial identity if I'm privileged? So on and so forth. We have pre-reflection, post-reflection. That is a way or an instrument for them to sort of see how they've developed over time in their thinking, right? It also becomes for us, especially the facilitator, a way to gauge where to take the students. We always take them where they're at, but we also want to move them to anti-racist advocacy. We have peer and self-evaluations, where peer here is about student expectation of learning that Dr. Skurlock-Lowe was talking about earlier, where students are responsible not only for their own learning, but they're holding their other peers accountable for learning. So in projects, how did such and such do in your project? What do you think they need to do more of? In dialogue, how are your peers doing? What do you want to hear more about, right? And they're self-evaluating themselves, right? So very different innovative ways of thinking about how to teach, how to learn based on anti-racism that really goes against some of the more traditional ways we as faculty are trained to teach. We have a wonderful, the paired textual analysis is they read a text by a person of color. Obviously, again, people of color have contributed to these histories and these disciplines. So bringing their voices in as authorities is important for students to see that those contributions exist, but then also having them talk about their differing interpretations based on their social identities of the same text, and then engaging one another. How did you come to that conclusion of the same text that I saw very differently? And then the last thing is an advocacy project, which I think Dr. Bowen might talk about, but essentially this is here, now that you've learned all of this stuff, how are you going to act? And this really pushes them into, you have agency, you have power, right? You now understand power in terms of how it operates, not just at Villanova, but in the United States. What can you do to buck up against that? And to come up with a proposal, whether it's relevant to Villanova or their profession, where they can absolutely take on or challenge some of the racist, or it's not just about race, other social identities, social oppressions that exist, they're really pushing up against that. Two last points in terms of how we assess, as Dr. Skurlock-Lowe said, instead of focusing on academic achievement, the check boxes, did you do this, we are looking at assessing process. How engaged are you? How self-reflexive are you being? What questions are you critically formulating, right? So super engaged, very engaged. Engaged is very different from the rubrics that we're traditionally used to. And it reorients students to think about, again, some of these values that anti-racism is trying to promote in the classroom, right? Self-criticality, self-reflexivity, but then also how much are you engaging other people, for example, in dialogue, and so on and so forth. The last thing I just wanted to give you a quick glance at is the disciplinary. So this is what it would look like. And you'll notice that the asynchronous model, which was all in these last iteration and this iteration, were actually faculty who are helping in the production. They actually came in and did class presentations that we now have pre-recordings for. So we're using those for now until the production is ready. But everything in blue is the asynchronous stuff. And then you'll usually see a dialogue soon after. So we do the Moldens next week, for example, and then there's going to be a dialogue. We're going to then go into the intellectual stuff. And again, interspersed always with dialogue. And then once the asynchronous material is done, March 17th, there you see the beginning of what we call the disciplinary content, where here I'm looking at the disciplines of history, journalism, communication, art, literature, biology, evolutionary science, gender, women's studies. And the objective here, again, is to have students interrogate the disciplines as political sites of knowledge production, which therefore means there's power in these and therefore power inequities. So where do they show up? How do they show up? What questions can we ask, right? So it's not a deep dive in any one discipline more than it is about showing how the disciplines themselves are problematic sites of racist knowledge production, and to have students begin to learn how to formulate critical questions so that they're not passively just learning, but actively engaging in material and pushing back when they see inequities within the very knowledge that's being given to them. I don't know if I've gone over, Sherry, I'm sorry if I have, but I'll turn it over to Sherry next.
Okay. Let me just get back to the slides. Not that we really need them, thank you. The predecessors here have said a lot of really wonderful things that are echoed through the dialogue piece that is, as you saw from the schedule that Hibba was showing, scattered throughout the course. I mean, there are multiple ways that could work out. It could be that it might be, I'm sorry, I'm trigger happy with the mouse. And I apologize to my colleagues for doing that earlier. So it might be that somebody would teach the course and would have a module followed by something from their discipline. How does the discipline of nursing, for instance, how do they conceptualize race after they've done the intellectual history of the development of the concept of race? And then dialogue about that. The dialogue allows us to really grapple with, internalize, personalize, find out how people are experiencing the knowledge that they are learning, right? And so what you see is that a lot throughout the course, we're sort of modeling and mirroring the processes that Rachel really talked about in Why This at Villanova, in terms of building our responsiveness of students, right? To give them tools where they can avoid being defensive or being paralyzed with guilt, with only apologizing, but being able to understand, to listen for understanding, to be able to ask questions of one another, to get at the heart of, well, what does that feel like for you? And why does that feel different for me? We often say in intergroup dialogue, the pedagogy that is being used in the course that we are talking about and through difference, and really trying to engage in that, to understand what the manifestations of these problems are. When we talk about that advocacy project in the end of the class, it is really to, as we understand the intellectual academic pieces of it, as we understand the personal engagement with it, what kind of proposals can we come up with for change? So it could be a curricular change, it could be an organizational change, and the dialogue experience helps anchor that as well and serve as an additional set of resources as the students are working towards that proposal. There's so much packed into a semester that we can only get to the proposal part of it, but I'm hoping that some of those proposals will come to fruition. We envision all kinds of repositories where we can exchange information, both for students as well as for faculty and staff who are working with this project. The dialogue experience facilitators are IGD trained, intergroup dialogue trained. It is a particular pedagogy that does, and here's what they do, you can see that. In the space, so there's training and ongoing training. I'm going to race through some of this really. In the space, they learn how to maximize the participation, empower students to co-construct a dialogic environment that allows them to really be fully present in the space, not just engaging in, oh, so-and-so said this, let me memorize that for the exam. But it's then pausing to say, okay, what does it feel like to find out that Augustine was African and likely had darker skin, right? He was from Africa, he had darker skin, right? What does that feel like? Students will say, I didn't know about it. Students will say, it just changes my whole perspective. if we don't know how we got where we are in terms of the land and how the university has developed, that becomes something that's really, why did we start there? Also, by the way, meet students where they are. They're come here, they're very excited, and now they have to look at this, right? What does it actually look like? I have a lot of slides here about how the dialogue works. I know that some of this can seem difficult. It is challenging for students to realize that they are not as far along as they think they are. And that I love my colleague Hiba always says, we all have work to do. It's just different work sometimes. So how do we meet each other and help each other walk through that work, stay engaged in the work, experience and lean into the discomfort that we realize that when our assumptions are not supported, or that we followed something that we believed to be true and find out that it was not. And I know many of you have been to other programs that the IGR program and ODEI have put on, and we talk about these agreements for interaction that are really good reminders for navigating the process. And we feel that it is crucial, and it adds a really amazing element to the course to have a DEF alongside the instructor of record, so that they are specially trained to deal with conflict, to deal with tension, to surface that tension. Most faculty members are not fully equipped to deal with that. So how do the facilitators work with that? The instructor is in the room. It's the facilitator, the DEF, the Dialogue Experience Facilitator, that is in charge in that area. Okay. We talked about some of these things that they are going to do. I would be remiss. How do we learn how to do this? How are the dialogue experience facilitators are trained through the IGD program? They're also going to be going through part of the Race and Justice Dialogue Institute, which is really designed for faculty who are interested in teaching the URJC. And I'm giving you the dates here. If you are interested, get in touch. We'll also be putting out a call in Campus Currents and through chairs and program directors and division directors to identify faculty who are interested in developing syllabi, in maybe using syllabi. The iterations are going to look different. We don't expect every single person who teaches the course to come up with a separate iteration. They might use one that somebody else in their college has developed, or they may tweak it, they may develop their own. This is going to be an evolving syllabus, I think, as we go forward. If you are interested, to keep in mind that it is the week after graduation, so we don't have conflicting obligations yet. If we have children, they are still in school, and we haven't quite hit the summer Fridays or summer vacation. So it is the first 4 days of that week, and then there's a follow-up because in the first Friday of the fall semester to share what did we work on over the summer, where are the syllabi for the next year, and hopefully in August this year we'll be able to fully see the produced modules. Fingers crossed that we'll be able to do that. What happens at the Institute? Super interactive. We've been talking at you in this hour. We hardly ever do that, actually. But what we do is we talk about how we can confront race and teach in an anti-racist kind of way to be more inclusive and equitable. And we start with self. IGD, the Intergroup Dialogue pedagogy, and work in ODEI often starts with self. Who am I as I enter the room, as I enter the space? Who are our students? How do we see one another? And why that matters in what we do within the classroom. And then learn, how can we continue to empower students, to bring them along in the, I think, wonderful and rich ways that both Dr. Skurlak-Low and Dr. Abu-Jaderi talked about. And in so doing, we can really bring to fruition the goals that Dr. Nance talked about at the very beginning. I'll stop there. And I believe we have some questions. Thank you so much for listening to us.
I'm not sure who has the screen, but if we could go to, we could take the PowerPoint down for a moment so that we could then see everybody. And I know that we're all behind our walls, except for Noreen. Thank you, Noreen. But could we begin to have a little bit of a conversation? We're so anxious to get your response, to
In
hear
the
what
last
you
2
think.
minutes, in our last 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Some of us can hang back too.
Absolutely. Oh, there's Morgan. Thank you. Good to see you. Hi, Rachel. Good to see you as well. Questions? I would ask two different questions. If you're faculty, would you be interested in teaching this? And if you're students, would you be interested in taking it? Hi, Astrid. Good to see you.
I'm just gonna jump in. I think I'm a student. Sadly I'm a senior, but I think had a course like this been like provided in my earlier throughout the 4 years, I think I definitely would have been interested, just because like throughout my sociology courses, I've learned the importance of dialogue, and I think this course really highlights that. And I feel like although the school kind of like provide sociology courses, those had to be I had to voluntarily like sign up for them. So I think even though I would have voluntarily signed up for this class, I think it would have allowed me to lean more into the discomfort that I think would have like really just helped me with kind of navigating and becoming anti-racist, especially at Villanova. So.
Thank you, Astrid. What do you think, by the way, if I could ask you a follow-up, is that okay? What do you think about making this course required?
I'm all for it. I was actually very surprised when I learned that I think it was like engineering and like business didn't have a diversity requirement. And I think given that it is a PWI, I think it should be required, especially just to make sure that we create a safe space for all students. And I think this really helps to kind of like push forward for that.
Thank you, Astrid.